Whoa, I'm really surprised so many people are here. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. I wanted to make a joke about you're the only ones who want to hear about developer docs and hear a German speak English. But yes, it's an interesting topic for you, and I really like that we need better developer docs. And this topic is really to my heart, and I'm speaking from experience. This talk is all about the last 2.5 years where I took over a barely usable documentation site from my company and hopefully developed it into something developers can use. Because when I tried to follow the getting started of the documentation, I struggled to the point I literally was like, I have no idea how to get this set up. So I had to call an internal developer from my company, and yeah, that's not what you want your developers using the product to experience. I'm working remotely in the attic. You can see that in my YouTube videos. It's very small. I can barely stand. I'm 190 centimeters tall. And usually I'm working up, second floor, and when I come down, my kids are there. And one day I come down, and my little one, she was 9 at that time, was nearly in tears, really enraged because she tried to learn crocheting. I saw a speaker here doing some of that, like socks, and she's just trying to learn the basics. Who has tried crocheting? A lot of developers do this. Yeah, a few. You know, when you're just starting out, this is a really, really hard thing to do, especially when you're a kid, your motoric skills are not developed completely. And you start out and the string gets wrapped wrongly about your hand, and then you have to follow some very strange things to get to get started. And she watched a tutorial on YouTube. And she got really enraged because it didn't work. And then was telling her, yeah, that's not easy if you're just starting out. I know, because I once had dreadlocks, can't imagine this. But I wanted to have a head, and I also had to learn how to do this. And it was not that easy. So she followed the YouTube tutorial and couldn't make it. So if you think about it from the product side, if you're developing a product, you have no documentation, nobody can use it because nobody knows how to use it. And if you have bad documentation, bad getting started, people will not enjoy using a product because they can't get all the features to work. And that was the same with the YouTube tutorial my daughter was following in. So this is the first part. I want to show how we got from documentation that's barely usable to documentation that supports your product. And the second one, this is the more technical side of the talk, speaks about, okay, how to not patronize or enrage your users. Because my daughter was really enraged. Why are you so enraged? I asked her, and she said, yeah, the woman on the video said it was easy. And if you ever read a README on GitHub or documentation where it tells you, just do this, and you try it and it doesn't work and you don't know what to do, this feels really patronizing. Like, you really think, whoa, this is, yeah. So never ever tell someone something is easy. If you've never done something before, it's always hard. You have to learn it. And this can be remedied by linting, for example. But we will come to that. So now I talked a lot about what I think about documentation and what good documentation is. Why is documentation so important? If you don't take it from me, because you don't know me, and I'm just a small developer advocate at a small startup, take it from the experts of developer marketing who did a survey /data. It's Q3 in 2023, and they asked around 17,000 developers from about 154 countries. What's important about a product, or what is the most important resource you learn about a product? And the overwhelming majority said that the documentation is the single most important resource to developers for using the product or getting to know about the product, which is remarkable. Here's a graphics of this. This is a developer relations focused study, and you can see that a lot of effort in DevRel is put into conferences and trade shows, but yeah, but this is not what developers want. Yeah, it's like 63% for DevRel budget, but only 9% of developers really want DevRel to actually go to conferences and present. We also see that documentation and sample code is in need, and it's also the highest bar for the importance of developers. So documentation is really, really important for developers. Also, Tessa Kriesel posted 2 days ago, how are developers actually using your resources? And the first thing they try to evaluate is the product for me? Does it have the features? So they go to your homepage and evaluate, is this product for me? And then developers usually, if they vetted the product, yeah, it could work, they go to your docs. So also here, like the developer journey for your product is, docs are very important. So how do we go from being enraged, not being able to use your product, to actually a usable product and documentation, and not churn your developers right away when they jump into the documentation? So let's see how we can get there. Who has used or seen the Stripe docs? Yeah, a lot of people, because if you Google good docs or well done docs, you will see the Stripe docs. And let's see if we can jump into them, into the Stripe documentation. So this is a little bit overwhelming, but what I really like about the Stripe documentation are two things. So you can browse by product, and usually you want to do something with payments. And then you have these cards, and you learn interactively how to, for example, accept the online payments. So you can click here, and then you can see, you can download the full app. That's always nice. And then you can step by step, and you can also see what's happening here. If I go, you can also see the code and copy it over to your thing you want to implement. So that's really well done. In this talk, you will not learn how to build this, because they implemented their own framework for this. So they went to great length to get to this user experience. But we can get to 80% with standard components that are out there. A few more examples. If you're interested in, those are developer portals, then you can go to pronovix.com, blog best developer portals. That's from 2022, but there's also a 2023 report where they say, where they rate developer portals. And you can see they're a little bit different, but you can see something like the Stripe docs. And what I want to point out is the Ivan documentation on the bottom left. To get to this documentation, which is really integrated with the SDKs and interactive, they need about 2 years to get there. And now they're happy with it. And we will see that, we'll see some of these examples later in the presentation. So let's start with our journey. I have to. So when I started out, my first day at the company, I went to the docs and found this. So I was on the homepage, I clicked on the docs link, which was a little bit hidden, not too cool for developers, but I found it, and then I got this. So this is the first point where a lot of developers already churn. Why? Because, cool, we have a reiteration of the features I already saw and vetted on the homepage. So, not cool, just grab it. Okay, then I get on getting started. And again, I get the features reiterated again. I just want to use the library. I just want to use the library. Please, give me the library. Okay, let's go to getting started. Maybe that's the right thing. How do I install this? And then I get a bunch of commands. I even get if I don't know NPM, I don't know what I'm doing here, and I get the dependencies explained and all of that. And the fun thing is, there was even an error it didn't even install if you had the wrong node version. Like you needed 17 and not 16. So they're barely usable. I got it to work somehow with the help of another engineer, and I know NPM. If you're coming from Java or Python, you're completely screwed. That's not going to work. And then I went to the API and thought, yeah, cool. I have all these, have these tables of contents. You have to now ask you as a test automation, an UI automation library. So you click on elements and the things, and you have this table of contents, which is extensive. It also, you have commands, which doesn't make any sense when you think about UI automation. What is a command, or what is a filter, or what is a relation? Maybe that's something with elements. And you think, okay, the first thing I want to do is to click on an element. How do I do that? Yeah, maybe I use click. Cool. Does it get any better? So maybe mouse left click. No. How do I use this? There's a little bit of documentation. Yeah. But I have to know what is text, what is button. So you see, even if you got it installed, and our metrics showed that people churned right after the first 2 or 3 steps, they couldn't use the library. So the people who got it installed, who made one inference, churned afterwards. So there wasn't really developers using our documentation. In this version, we already had a search bar. One thing you can do if you have at least comprehensive documentation is implement a nice search. You can even do it with AI nowadays. There are even products who provide this out of the box, like for example, Mintlify. You just have to buy the product, and then you can use OpenAI, and they do something like retrieval augmented generation and generate your answers. So that wasn't even there when I started. It's the wrong version I pulled there. So you were completely on your own, and the documentation didn't help. So that, yeah, a little bit helpless here as a developer. So I didn't know anything about technical writing, but I knew developers are built different than deciders. That's what I knew. So if you're talking to a developer, they usually have a use case in mind or a goal in mind. They only use the features on your homepage to see if the features provide for the user goal. And that's all they need to know. The features are there, and then they're not important anymore. They want to implement the user goal. So they don't need to reiterate the features. That's basically nonsensical to them. That's the noise. So when I go to a documentation, I want directions. So for our docs, I try to implement some rag example just to try it out, and I used LangChain for this because it's easy. And the cool thing about LangChain is that the documentation is really extensive, and I only needed one page where everything was on the page. So the only thing the LangChain documentation had to do was to how get it installed, which was easy in Python. It was one command. And then I needed this one page to implement my whole use case. So that was nice. I just needed the right direction, the right page. LangChain provided in their docs, perfect. And when you talk to developers in sales calls, a lot of the sales people called me into sales calls if they were very technical and helped the developers set up or the customers set up their environment. The best customers was the developers. They just said, I need this, I need that, and 3 other resources. You just emailed them the resources. And the next day, they wrote you an email and said, hey, that was really cool, got it to work. I even submitted a pull request to your library to extend it that way. And yeah, developers just need directions. Also, coming back to my daughter, when they start to crochet, they need a specific tool for this. And this tool needs some kind of instruction. That's why they watch the YouTube video. Watch YouTube videos, both are crocheting. So think about your documentation like a tool, and this tool needs an instruction manual. You can't use a hammer to hammer in a screw. That's not going to work. Yeah. So you need the right manual for your product. So with that in mind, I tried to implement this in our documentation. You see the search is more prominent in the middle now. And okay, I simplified the getting started. So now we have Gitpod, where you can just open it in a browser. It's a remote development environment running on Kubernetes, and you just can test out AskUI. That's it. If you can do this, there's also something like StackBlitz or Bolt it's called, I think now. If you can do it with your product, use this. It's very fast. You don't have to install something locally. Very easy to vet your product. Very cool. See this on a lot of pages, like for example, Docusaurus. And then we have local installation. So we get rid of all the features. We don't have a homepage reiterating the features. Just you get in. Here are directions, what you want to do. We also have a terminology. That's something we needed for our product because we have a lot of specific UI testing, and also it's a service that runs on your local machine and talks to the cloud, and there are a lot of AskUI prefixed names. So I created a terminology. I'm coming from software architecture. That's very important to talk about the right things, also internally. We have some guides here. And yes, troubleshooting got expanded. The next thing was the API. If you look at the table of contents now, it's more easily searchable because you can also expand it. That looks much better than before. Yeah, it's an explanation. If you need a simple mouse click, tap only, use mouse left click. And here's an example of how to use it. I love examples as a developer. That's the most important thing after an API documentation. So if you put the examples in the API documentation, really nice. That's the thing I want to hear. Oh, that's still German here. I had to translate the slides. So that means beautiful. For who is it important for you as developers that the docs are beautiful? Begs the question, what is beautiful? Who here did some DevOps or server configuration? Who knows this page? There's someone nodding. There's always someone in the audience who nods. This is from the Nginx documentation. They have the most simple and basic documentation I've ever seen. It's just a one-pager with barely any markup. But it's so usable that you can configure a whole reverse proxy with just this one page. Because it's everything a developer needs to get it to work. So if you want to have a custom error page, you hit Command or Control F and search for error page, and you get all you need. That's neat, and I think beautiful. So for me, it's always like design follows function. The stripe docs are not per se beautiful. They're useful, and for that they look beautiful. So with that in mind, I tried to improve our docs further. And to be honest, I had to buy a few technical writing books from then on because I hit a roadblock. I was like, okay, I have these directions. What do I do here now? Okay, we can do something like how AskUI works. That's sometimes important for developers to know. Is it running the cloud or local? We have the installing AskUI, which has some more information. We also hide all the dependency stuff. Maybe someone wants to read it. and we structured it like what our users typically would do. So what do we do with a UI automation? You select elements. So there's a whole bunch of element selections here. And we want to execute automations on single devices, multi-device, and so forth. We also had new tutorials for everything. Use cases are always nice. But to be honest, I was like, maybe that's not the right approach. It doesn't feel right. So how do I improve this further? That was the next question. So is this useful? Yes, we saw some increase in our developer activity. We didn't have that much churn, but we still had problems if we had real testers who were not test automation testers. So every time somebody came to us with barely any knowledge of an IDE, they struggled. So what do? You buy a book, something like The Product is Docs, and I strongly agree with the title. As I said before, if you don't have good or well-done docs, your product is not usable. So basically your product and your docs are the same. So I bought this book, read it from start to finish, learned a lot about another technical writing books. Some were not as good, but there was another one who talked about learning objectives and segmentation. So segmentation is something I knew from marketing a little bit. So they do user segments like, okay, all Indian users or all users in the States. So why would I do this for our customers? That's a good question. Why would I do this for our customers? Because everyone else is doing it, so they must have a point. So if you look at Platform OS, for example, you see they have these different directions. Like you have a get started, if you just want to get started, then you have a developer guide, you have an API reference. By the way, did you know that 50% of API usage is from non-developers, but business people? So that's interesting. Then we have best practices, use cases, and platform use case. I don't know what that is. So they all do some kind of segmentation here. Also, ABN AMRO, FinTech, they also have APIs, how to get started, and they also have a developer blog. So there are different segments of users here. So they must have a point to segment this. So how do you segment users? Yeah, you look at the user goals. And the user goals are an interesting thing. They are based in the real world. What does that mean? Let's look at some examples we derived from our segmentation journey. So example user goals for our AskUI library was, the user wants to automate an Android device, a native Android device. That was one user goal. The user wants to automate a native Windows application. And the user wants to automate a native macOS app. There was only 3 user goals. That's interesting. How did we come to these user goals? And as developers, we don't want to talk normally to customers, but we should talk to customers directly if we can. But if we don't, then sales is your friend. I talked to a few sales people in my company. They usually talk to customers and they can get me the information what the customers need to do or want to do with our product. Also marketing, if they're doing their job correctly, they do segmentation. They can tell you what your users want to achieve. And support. If a user has a problem, normally support has to understand what the user wants to achieve. As a developer advocate, community is also a great resource. You can ask people directly or see what their problems are or what their feedback is, and you get the user goals. So now you have the user goals. This is what our users want to achieve with our library. It was a little bit complicated for AskUI because we had 3 user groups, maybe 4. So from technical to nearly non-technical. So very diverse set of user goals and segmentation. That's difficult. But in an ideal world, you only have one user group or two. And then you can say, okay, how do we achieve these user goals for our users? And now it becomes interesting, because then you learn about learning objectives. And learning objectives are usually not rooted in the real world. They are intellectual goals, which sounds very abstract. So what do I mean by this? We have three categories of learning objectives. And I brought some examples. So we have one: the user should be able to connect our software with their device, native Android or iOS or Windows, native Windows. That's an applicable skill, this is the first category. Then the user should be able to describe the different methods used to select text. You see, this is just awareness, you just know. The user should be able to choose the most applicable text selection method in their specific scenario. That's comprehension. So now you know you can select text or just direct your cursor to a specific text segment. But how do you do this in a specific user scenario? You can use a regex, you can use exact text matching, you can use fuzzy matching. There's all methods you can use to just select text. And here comes the funny thing. To achieve a user goal, it doesn't suffice to know about all the text selection methods. You need to know how to use them, that's comprehension. And you also need to have a device connected. So you need at least 3 learning objectives to achieve a specific user goal. And text selection alone is not a user goal. That's not basically, yeah, you automated a native Android app, for example, but that's not what you want to achieve. You want to achieve a lot more. So it's more like, okay, at least 3 for user goal, but you have a lot of learning objectives. And when you were at the talk of Emma Bursdorf yesterday, she talked about how developers learn, or how learning in general works. It's always like, if you build something, and that's the most stressful way of learning, building something, but also the most effective, you're always in the cycle, okay, how do I do this? I need to be aware of something, then I need to understand the something, and then I need to apply it. And you learn step by step, and then you cycle through these learning objectives, basically to build something that you can use, that you can show, an example. So that's the hardest way to learn, but also the most effective. And your documentation should be structured like this, like awareness, comprehension, applicable skill around these learning objectives. So why am I stressing learning objectives? So we had Android setup, how to set up an Android device that you can automate from a Windows device, for example. And the fun thing about learning objectives is that they are modularized. So we had this documentation on how to set up an Android device and automate it like 3 times in our documentation. And in our Discord community, there always came up questions about how to set up an Android device. Because depending on the entry point of the user, they were either confused or got it to working. And then we changed one entry point, but forgot the other 2. And it was a mess. So the learning objectives should be modularized. Each learning objective should be encapsulated. And I can't go into a lot of detail on how to craft nice and well done learning objectives, but there's a whole book about it. But I couldn't find it anymore. That problem is not available at the moment. So if you modularize your documentation, you can say, okay, I have the setup of an Android device, and I have 3 other pages, 3 other learning objectives, like how do I do multiple devices, for example, and then they just reference the learning objective 1. That's the most important part. So you get a little bit like modularizing software, just get these modules and you can reuse them. So every learning objective only has 1 reason to change. And then you get this tree, and you can say, okay, I can do this. So that gave me a nice starting point on how to restructure the documentation. And despite the logo change, the starting page completely changed. Like, okay, now we have a quick start. And we saw 5 different user goals. People came to us. So how do I automate Windows? How do I automate Android? How do I automate macOS? How do I automate Linux? And I added the enterprise checklist because we had a lot of enterprise customers, and the enterprise customers usually had to implement something with the testers, and testers only knew their internal network, and every time they had to talk to our cloud, there were problems. So, like, they didn't have admin access, they had proxy issues, and all that funny stuff you have in an enterprise environment. So I added this. So now you know where to click. So I want to automate Android. Then I get on Android and see, oh, okay. Depending on which use case my carrier, my local machine is working on, I have to connect the Android device. I first have to go to the Windows getting started. You see this tree of learning objectives. So I don't reiterate the Windows installation in the Android getting started, but I just say, okay, go there, follow this, and then come back. And this is also what we did in the guides. We had some examples here. I think the Taurus, yes. A little thing about psychology. You saw these guides before. There were like 7 or 8 of them. The element selection thing was like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And the fun thing about menu items is there are studies about psychology. People can hold 5 to 9 or can comprehend 5 to 9 menu items. But there are also studies to say people can only get 3 at a time. So the less menu items you have, the better. So you have to really think about that. Yeah. So we restructured this. That was the most important part. What I always want to show, but it always fails, is that we managed to get the Android stuff out. So we have tutorials here, but we have web search on Android with Flutter sample Android app and all that stuff. And I only wanted to see how we set up Android, and I think that's not there. Yeah, that's the wrong version. But usually you see we only have one Android setup. That's important. Yeah, it's here. Automating mobile devices. Yes, and then it's only the Android setup and the iOS setup. And you can debate if that should be also learning objectives. And what you generally want to have is one learning objective has one page, so you only change this page if the learning objective changes. No, that's not what I want. Okay, so I think now our documentation is, from a structure viewpoint, is okay. It's not a Stripe docs, but it's getting there. So what we would want to have is something like interactive command instruction execution. That's really hard if the service has to run on your local machine. So we didn't get that to work in the browser, sadly. So how did we build this? Structurally, we have user goals. That's very important to talk to sales, support, to your customers. Talk to your customers, derive the user goals and the learning objectives. Structure your documentation around these user goals. Okay, design follows function. So how do you build this? I'm a big proponent of docs as code because I'm a developer and I don't want to use something like Confluence. Who uses a wiki for documentation? You people, you like it? Not as enthusiastic. I get it. The problem with docs in wikis or in other systems is that they have some very strange behavior. The first thing is editing. So it's not as easy for developers to edit in a wiki just because they have to leave their IDE. We want to be in our IDE. So we have our tools, just write some text, cool stuff, easy. Yeah, better than opening a wiki, having a strange rich text editor. It just doesn't feel nice. Next thing about docs as code is that it's just files, it's just text. So we can treat it like docs, like code. So we can do something like code review. If you have a docs change, developer writes the docs change, you can give it as a pull request or merge request to a technical writer, and they can review the documentation and do the same with code. So that's a nice feature. If you're in an enterprise environment, I worked in an enterprise environment before, it's very big on CI, so every document has to be in the right CI. For example, at Deutsche Bahn, it was like it has to be red, has the logo on the left top. You can do this with docs as code. You can, if you use Markdown or you use ASCII doc, that's no problem. You can style it with CSS or any other style sheet there and just generate anything out of it with the right tools. If you use Pandoc or Doc Toolchain, doesn't matter. You can even generate presentations and Word documents in the right CI. Cool. So even developers in enterprise are happy. What's also cool is, and what really bothered me about something like Confluence, for example, you don't have natural versioning. Like if you bundle the documentation with your library or with your product, you can say, okay, every time I create a new version of our product, we also create a new version of the docs automatically. So the tools, if you use for Markdown like Docosaurus, you can just say, give me a new version, and it creates a version for you. So your docs are automatically versioned with your product. That's cool. And it's not WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. Who loves working in Word? Oh, one person. I'm not fond of Word. Every time I use Word, it's like, let's do a headline, let's hit enter. And sometimes it stays a headline in the next line, and sometimes it becomes a standard text, and I don't know why. So that's really getting to me. And what you see is what you get is this behavior of Word. I'm a big fan of what you see is what you mean. Something like Markdown on ASCII doc. You say, this is a headline, this is standard text, this is code, and the formatter takes care of it. It's a little bit like, it's like LaTeX. It just looks good out of the box because you don't have to format it yourself. The tech stack we are using is Docosaurus. Alex is there because of inclusivity linting, and Whale. Docosaurus, it's like any other Markdown, like mkdocs thing. You just write Markdown files and it renders a nice HTML page with a lot of tools around it, like versioning and that stuff. Whale is an extensive linter you install on your machine, and you can do inclusivity linting. You can do something like, oh, I want to have the Google styles in my documentation, and lint for that. Would not recommend this for an existing documentation site. I said, okay, let's see if I can fulfill the Google styles, and with the documentation you saw before, it was like a list of 3,000 findings I had to fix to adhere to the Google style guide. Yeah, better start small and see what you can do. And with that, let's jump into how you do this. Let's kind of get this. Yes. Let's make it a little bit bigger. Okay. So if you have Whale installed, you also have a Whale ini where you define the Whale styles. Okay, I need this back. Where's my Whale ini? And I say, okay, I have the standard Whale styles, which are very simple to adhere to. Then we have Alex, which is inclusivity and accessibility linting, and we have specific styles just for us Germans who speak very weirdly in English. Yeah, that's it. That's the whole configuration of Whale. You can also do your own styles, and we will see this because AskUI is an own style. And what you do is you integrate this into a pre-commit hook, or you can run Whale all by yourself. I integrate this in a git commit hook, and let's get this away. Let's say if I said git commit, it will spit out a few errors I put in there, for example, and you can see we have some warnings. This is one warning from AskQI phrases here. Because in school, all Germans are told you have to say, you are going to. And the British think like, what are you doing here? Or if you have someone from the States, like I had a colleague from the States, he read our documentation and said, Johannes, you Germans are too wordy. Just say you will instead of you are going to. Shorter, more expressive. There's no rule for that. I wrote one. Same for E.G. For example, that's an abbreviation. Usually in technical writing, I learned you shouldn't do abbreviations. That's not inclusive. It's also harder to read for non-native speakers. So the first time I encountered E.G. I was like, what does that mean? So you want your writing to be clear. So I wrote an own rule for that. And it just says a warning. Please use you will instead of you are going to. There's also some, to come back to the start of the presentation, something like you don't want to patronize or condescending. Alex calls it condescending. You don't want to use words like easy or simple. It says, yeah, there's a simple, no, you don't want this. And next thing, you also see, especially in Germany, all the German writers who try to write English are using a lot of weasel words, and you want to have clear, simple, sometimes boring language in documentation because you want to get stuff done. You don't want to have something like arguably there. And you can also do this. So here's my you are going to learn. That was one of my favorite phrases in our documentation I got rid of. The way you do this is, Whale has an accept and reject out of the box, reject configuration. It's just a list of things you want to have in your documentation. Whale out of the box is not IT specific. It's more like English language specific. So you have, it doesn't know Jira or Okta or UIs or ESLint, for example. So you have to put this in the accept list. This accept list is quite long, but you have to do it. And you can also do something like the reject list. We don't have this here. Like you don't want to have some uninclusive language. Usually Alex gets rid of this and warns you. And if you're a non-native speaker, I highly recommend using something like a large language model to explain to you why something is not inclusive. So there were some words where I thought, why is that not inclusive? And then I asked Llama 3.2 and it explained to me in 4 paragraphs why in some cases something is not inclusive. So if you're a non-native speaker like me, that's really helpful. How do you implement new rules? Basically, this is regex matching. And every time you do regex matching, you try to solve one problem, and now we have 2. So you have to play around a little bit with this. So you say, with the swap rule, you are going to should be you will. So you can also put this on the reject list, but then you just get, yeah, you are going to, and that's rejected, but you also want to see what's the remedy of this. So you put a swap thing here. So that's how you do this. And it's really powerful because you can put in a git commit hook and you can put it in a GitHub action, for example, or in any other, where is it? Just closed it. So what we also did was, okay, put this in a workflow. This is GitHub Actions. You can also put it in GitLab CI, so that's not a problem. So it fails if there's some style issues like this. And you specify the files. We only want this on new docs at the moment, but not on the docs that are already there because there are a lot of versions and it's just duplication of the versions, and you would fix a lot of outdated versions and you don't want this. So you just say, okay, readme, docs, API, and all that stuff. That's cool. So now you say, yeah, I'm creating the styles in my repository, my docs repository. What if I want to do something like docs as code for all my organization? This is not a question I had, but a question I read in a blog from Camunda, and their solution was to create a repository, put the styles in there, and then they used it all over their documentation and their front ends to not have the same style and same language, which is quite cool. And what you do is link the styles folder. As you can see, this is a link here, a symlink on my folder. That's how you do it, and you have to check it out in your workflow, in your CI pipeline, and can use it. So that's how you do it. Okay. I think I'm more on time. It's also already late. So the takeaways, what did we want to achieve? We wanted to structure our docs so that developers can actually use it. And we wanted to get rid of weasel words and have a style guide, more or less. We have to do some linting here, so it's nice to read our documentation. So the first thing I did was, okay, I have developers come with a goal, so we have to have some user goals, and learned about learning objectives, structured our documentation around the learning objectives, around the user goals, so we can provide directions. I think we did a pretty good job there with the help of the engineers. The documentation is now usable, the churn reduced, and it's cool. For me, that's very opinionated. You can, hopefully someone disagrees with me, that's okay. Design follows function, so the Nginx documentation is still the most beautiful documentation I ever used because it was so effective. Oh, yeah. Then derive a user goals. Ask everybody who has customer contact, sales, marketing, community, support. That's your sources for the user goals. The real user goals, not the ones your founder thought users would do. So the real user goals. Then derive the learning objectives and structure in a way so that they are reusable, that they are modular. You get a modular documentation. And this is also opinionated. Use docs as code because you get all the things I described and you make your engineers happy who have to write documentation. So, thank you for staying so late for documentation and enduring my bad German English. Thank you.